All right. So hello again once and all. It's a great pleasure to have all of you with us. And I am extremely excited, and I'm sure all of us here are excited to have Professor Krishnendu Ray with us from New York University, and those who, of course, are engaged in the field of critical food studies or trying to understand food and taste in terms of the intersections with politics, culture, society, race, gender, and various other forms of our day-to-day intersections, are very much familiar with the name Professor Krishnendu Ray. But for the sake of formal introduction, he is currently working at New York University as a faculty in food studies, and also he is also the director of the food studies PhD program there. He has a fascinating range of work. One of his very initial work was, and its title is amazing, The Migrant Stable: Meals and Memories in Bengali American Households, published with Temple University in 2004. He co-edited a volume called Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia with the UC Press, University of California Press, back in 2012. He has another fascinating work called The Ethnic Restaurator, and it was published in 2016 by Bloomsbury. And then, of course, he has edited, co-edited, contributed in multiple journals, engaging with the question of food. And what is really fascinating, like, of course, amongst all of the different works, what is really fascinating with Professor Ray is that one of the essential aspects that he looks into his work is how tastes, cultures, palates, cuisines, ingredients move from one space to another, whether it's a cultural space, historical space, political space, and different other spaces. So, once again, a warm welcome, Prof. And we are very, very happy to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Shayon.
So, if I start with a very, very basic question, and the question is, and I'm specifically very interested to know because, of course, I know that you are a Bengali, and being a migrant in the United States, and especially Bengalis, of course, like every other communities, food plays an essential role in terms of our cultural identity in the Bengali households. And often from time to time, that has led to the formation of a lot of cultural, of course, problematic cultural chauvinisms. But also that was also a way of preserving the ancestral culinary cultures, household culinary cultures, the culinary cultures adopted from the grandparents, from the great grandparents, if it associates with partition and various other factors. Refugee factors could be a factor. So how did you negotiate with yourself, being a migrant in the United States when you first went there? How did you negotiate with this politics of taste there?
Fantastic question. First, I have to say, I'm like half a Bengali. And so my mother is Odia. She comes from Giri family. We have mostly been raised in Odisha. So we were in some ways migrants already in India, Provashi Bengali. And then my father was a salesman. So he got transferred every 2 years, more or less. So born in Siliguri, raised in Cuttack, Bhubaneswar, Balasore, my grandparents, and then Jamshedpur, Kolkata, and Benares, and eventually ended up in Delhi, as happens often with upwardly mobile, middle class, lower middle class people. And so, in some ways, when I first came to the United States, it felt like, well, just another journey, another city. Okay. And once I had gotten used to Delhi and its brutality, every other city felt easy in some ways. And so kind of that was kind of one of the dimensions. But the other one, more important one, specifically related to food was I sometimes tell my anthropological friends, like say David Sutton, that I'm like an inverted anthropologist. So I I recognize the lacuna in my work uh, as I left India. And I'd been involved in all kinds of progressive politics, but no one had told me to go home and cook. I had largely been fed by women, my mother, my aunts, domestic workers, and like sociologists say in India, right? There's a red line running between people who have servants and who are servants. And I had never kind of thought about food seriously. I loved eating it, consuming it, but never thought about it. So it was in SUNY Binghamton. I was in this graduate program. That's the only place I had applied because I had known about the world systems folks, people like Giovanni Arrighi, Manuel Wallerstein. We used to meet a couple of times a semester at Professor Giovanni Arrighi's home. And we would sit around. That's the first place in my life I met an Iranian, an Afghan, a Bangladeshi, Namibian, okay, from all over the world. It was a grad program that attracted people from all around the world. And of course, one of the things that becomes important in this encounter with one another is, in fact, aspects of quotidian life, the music you listen to, and the food you eat. And it was in, by the way, in Professor Arigi's dining table that for the first time I had a slice of pizza. I left India before pizza had become popular, and I've come back to India every year. It was not visible, not very popular. It's the first place where I had a glass of grappa, a shot of grappa. And that is where, in his library, I ran into a book, Jack Goody's Cooking, Cuisine, and Class. So I asked him if I could take it, and I read it, and I said, wow, you can think about food and social structure in such a smart and kind of intensive way. And so that brought together that reading brought together my everyday experience that was already emerging, where I had become a cook, a very bad cook, for the longest time. And the past parts of Indian cooking is very forgiving, like making a dal. You can screw up a dal, but very difficult to screw up a dal. Unlike other things that need more precision. So rice, dal, I would make a sabzi, and then I would maybe have a piece of fish, a pan seared. Okay. Slowly started cooking. And of course, in grad school, if you can cook, you're a very popular guy. So all my grad school friends from all over the world would come over. They would come over with beer or wine, and then I would cook, and maybe with a friend of mine, and then of course we would argue about everything in the world that we had previously in the day discussed in class on Marx and Weber. Here I was in a sociology program. So that was the context. So in some ways, I was assaulted to directly answer your question. Like most immigrants, transnational immigrants, and my first set of examples was in fact intranational immigrants. There is kind of nostalgia and a sense of loss and an attempt to um, uh, conserve, which sometimes gives us quite conservative politics also. And it is in the process of attempting to eat the food I could not find otherwise that I started engaging deeply with eventually questions that would write almost 20 years later on doing and thinking. Like I have an anthropology of consciousness piece about body and body techniques and technology, and which is related to this whole question of how do we learn to do stuff that is mostly habitual for most people, and how that changes our conception of the world and conception of ourself.
Wonderful. I think that's a very, very interesting response to start with, Prof. And when I was listening to you, I got specifically very interested in the term that you used as a bad cook. And also this question is not just about the question about, and since you're speaking so much from the embodied experience, I want to
Yeah.
slightly spotlight on this phrase of the bad cook, and which also
Well,
deeply ties to, I think, with your work, the ethnic restaurator as well. The term good cook and bad cook, since
mhm.
our childhood days, of growing in any kind of household, we have been hearing this terminology being used very categorically, but and also very casually as well in a lot of ways. But then when we kind of think deeply, we also see that this is not so casual as it is usually used in our daily life. It is deeply entrenched with the question of politics. Like, for example, I come from a household who traces his ancestry from different parts of Bangladesh. And in the Bengali language, we usually will be called as Bangal. And then we also know the kind of, culinary tensions in the conflict, which probably right now is not in a state of tension, mostly in terms of petty jokes. But there was a time in terms of tension where Bangals will actually make, kind of mock Ghoti for using and not using certain kind of spices or cooking food according to the Bangal standards, which are extremely bland. And whereas the Ghotis will mock the Bangals and say that you people just use a lot of red chilies and a lot of spices because you have never cultivated a wide array of taste. So, this is one small example just to sort of flesh out that how this whole construction of intergenerational construction of bad cook and good cook is associated deeply with the question of ethnicity and the question of authenticity, and both are very confusing, very complex, and so deeply contestable. Across generations, across times, and across spaces. So, someone like you, and I believe it won't be, quite a bit of wrong to sort of tell that you landed up into this field quite accidentally, because you already mentioned that it's not something like from your childhood days you dreamt of something. It was quite accidental, but also, of course, I believe a welcoming accident. So someone of this, from this perspective, from these set of contexts, how would you sort of define or understand through your embodied individual and collective experiences this notion of ethnicity and authenticity, if you can share with us?
Perfect. That's a beautiful question. Of course, remember, Sion and everyone else, it's not like I have answers to this. I'll probably have more questions. So let me start. It is a beautiful example, a good one, on this question of bad cook. And I'll talk about ethnicity and authenticity in a bit. But for instance, it in fact starts with my mother, characterized as a bad cook, in the household. So she's Odia, and my parents were absolutely revolutionary at a point of time in a small town in Balasore, where they married each other against constraints of caste, and all the prejudices associated with each other. Bengalis, especially Bengali elites, Bengali intellectual elites, always had this deep disdain for Odias. That's why I have always self-identified more as Odia, partly to kind of fight back against Bengali elite notions of their own culture. And my mother, as an Odia, in fact, a girl at that point of time, young woman, was her father's favorite. So when initially her in-laws were very opposed to the marriage, they eloped to Kolkata and then they came back. So, which is also the story of big city, and freedoms of big cities in terms of surveillance. In small communities, we often over sentimentalize small communities. Small communities are good, but they are deeper in terms of surveillance, successful surveillance. So The astonishing thing is, eventually my paternal grandmother said to my mother's father, Dadu, that your daughter is kind of has is great, is adjusted to everything, but she's a terrible cook. Uh, and um, and she was a terrible cook because she had never cooked, which is very unusual, because she was her father's favorite. And her father had protected her from the kitchen. And she had cooked for the first time, she told me. This came out much later in life. When she went to Delhi, remember, this is from Balasore, and no one was flying those days. Um, went to Delhi, went to a teaching school for home economics and as a kind of a training, and cooked for the first time there chicken curry. And she doesn't know how to cook it. So who does she call? She calls her father in Balasore on a landline, okay, to a neighbor. We never grew up with phones at that point of time, or even in this is of course before me. And her father talked her through how to cook chicken curry in Delhi to her Odia daughter. And this Odia daughter then moves into my father's household, which is a household with 13 kids. My father is one of the older ones. Okay. So she's cooking for about 17 to 20 people in charge of cooking. Okay. And so that is the context in which, in fact, lot of our cooking then eventually reflects my paternal grandmother's Takuma's cooking rather than my Dida's cooking, because she learns a lot of it there. So this question of a bad cook, I love your question because I kind of used it too casually. And I think what you're pointing to is the disciplining nature of this question of the good cook and the bad cook. And this is at the heart of the gastropolitics of the home. And women, especially young women who move from their natal homes to their married homes, is probably at the heart of the basic dynamism in any cooking system in the world. Okay? That's where all the interesting things happen in the world. When women leave their households, natal households, and go to their in-laws, in this case, my mother, bringing certain things, dropping certain things, facing often disdain and distrust, especially if they're entrapped in a hierarchy like my mother was, where the Bengalis were never happy enough with the Orias because they never thought they were civilized enough. So that tension, my mother negotiated through that. And of course, in some ways, I had not heard any of this story, and which would have been such a loss if I had not heard any of this. Uh, and I heard this because I started talking to her relatively recently, only after my accidental transformation into a food studies scholar, which in some ways has been the greatest pleasure of my life, that it has opened up domains and dimensions of thinking that I would not have thought about before. Related to your second question, which is related question, which is this question of ethnicity and authenticity. And of course, in some ways, the Odia Bengali context already illuminated to me these dimensions of tension between hierarchies of taste, just like your East Bengalis and West Bengalis, right? Bengal and Khoti, etc., which we were all entangled in when there would be an East Bengal and Mohun Bagan soccer match in Kolkata when I was going to school there, ninth and 10th grade. Came to learn about it, but that looked very similar in some ways to the question of archetypes and stereotypes around it. And with ethnicity, of course, in some ways, I think the best way I try to think about it is with the kind of Bhojpuri saying, "Kose kose par pani badle, chare kose par pani." So in some ways, every 2 miles, the kind of the language changes, and every four, in some ways, taste. Because in South Asia, pani is in fact water is a referent to taste and terroir, much more than in Europe. It is territory, terroir. In South Asia, I think it is water. People talk about it as water. Is it sweet or is it not sweet? So of course, in this kose kose par pani badle chare kose par vani, there's a sensibility that a location is linked to ethnicity, is linked to language, is linked to terroir, is linked to taste. Okay. And which, of course, always then encounters this question of the self and the other. Who is the self and who is the other in this contingent sensibility? My early experience, I think, in a bilingual, my in Odia, I is the maternal grandmother, not the Gujarati I. And between my I and my Takuma, and the tensions in it, and the questions of taste, and the questions of replication, and the question of continuation. So, and your last point related to that, authenticity is, of course, in some ways, is a complex term that is mostly dismissed by scholars, but that, in fact, underlines true quest in people. That's why it never goes away. It haunts. One is the question of accuracy, and the other is the question of sincerity. Okay. And authenticity in some ways is constantly playing hide and seek with kind of continuity and change. Okay. So every time we cook, we're, of course, some things are changing. Every time I cook the same dal, the dal tastes slightly different. And sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse by some judgments around it. So this construction, so in some ways, there's this double construction, I think about it. One is of the self and the other. And the other dimension of it in the matrix is continuity and change. Every time we cook, we are trying to do something that is either similar or something new. And we either end up with something new or with something old. And I'll end with the last example there. In the migrants table, I was I was astonished to find, and that might not be astonishing for the other people after the fact. I surveyed about 126 households, went and ate, and was made a inventory of their refrigerator for interesting experiences. People would say we don't eat any industrial food, but their refrigerator, their freezer would be full of frozen pizza. So what people do and what people think and what people say are often different things. But in this context, what I was impressed with was this. As an immigrant, most of these people had quickly adapted to American breakfast and cereal, cold milk, maybe a toast. So all that had become quickly Americanized, partly because of constraints of modern urban life, commutes, although they, very few of them had moved to coffee from tea. So in some ways, I would say the most marginal elements of our food culture, okay, but the addictive ones are probably the most continuous ones, like in this case, tea in one case. But the most interesting thing was breakfast had become very, almost 90% American very quickly, okay? But on the other side, dinner had become even more aggressively Bengali, more Bengali than in Kolkata. Yeah, how do I know? There's a USAID study, Kolkata 1976. I use as a baseline because most of my respondents had left Kolkata around that point of time or a little later. And it looked like Bengalis in Chicago were eating dinner that was a lot more Bengali than archetypically Bengali, where Bengalis would say bhat, mach, shobji, dals, okay? However, sometimes a little bit of chutney, etc. Okay, but usually three or four things. Dinner had become very aggressively Bengali. So I had to kind of figure out what is going on. So if I just looked at breakfast, I would say, oh my God, people had assimilated so quickly. And if I looked at dinner, I would say, oh my God, people had not assimilated at all. Yeah. And so, in fact, both those things are true. Eventually, I say in the migrants table book that in that sense, migrants reflect the leading edge of modernity. They are not outdated people from outdated places. They are, in fact, the leading edge of modernity, dealing with this central question of authenticity of their own tradition, its continuities and challenges of discontinuity in new contexts, which everyone eventually faces in the modern world. Migrants, in some ways, are a symptom, are a canary in the coal mine that show how people explain it or explain it away in terms of the dynamics of change.
Wonderful. Thanks for this very detailed response, Prof. Of course, I have more questions, but then it's an Adda, respecting the rituals of Adda. I just want to open up to all of us. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box. If you're shy, no issues with that. If you want to directly have a conversation with Prof. Ray, please just raise your hands, unmute yourself, and speak. Yes, so if anybody would like to go ahead, please feel free to. I know there are like a couple of comments. Jack Goody's Cooking, Cuisine, and Class is a very good book. Dr. Indrajit Bose shares that earlier there was great emphasis on being a purist in following culinary traditions, but now there is more blending and more liberalism. In fact, I mean, what Dr. Bose is sharing, and meanwhile, all of you, rest of you, just think around and thinking around your perspectives and thought sharing. I also wanted to add, and specifically why along with the question of ethnicity, I added the word authenticity as well, because when I was listening to you, and why this word authenticity troubles me so much, because every time I have like traveled, of course, within India, but then also outside India as well, you have this, you always have this a set of authentic Indian restaurants. Like you will always get
Yes,
a
yes.
Taj Mahal restaurant, you will always get an Andhra restaurant, you will always get a Tamil restaurant. So you have this sort of overarching representations. And of course, there are multiple stories. It could be migration, it could be, depending on the geopolitics of those locations, like it could be indentured laborers, it could be passenger Indians settling in, it could be multiple stories that weave around these representations. But how do they sort of cook up the authenticity in their taste, and especially when you were sharing, and I know having seen your social media reflections as well, where you often talk about uh, the representations of Indian street food. Like, how do you sort of collate that Indian street food in the United States? And when you get the taste, the kind of idea of authenticity or the originality that an individual have, of course, doesn't match with what they present. So they have assimilated their own version of authenticity. In fact, the same story goes with the question of curries as well. You have already co-edited the book on the curries, and
Mhm,
it's historically quite known to the world, the politics around the curries, how the British hijacked the idea of curries, manipulated and sold to the world as South Asian curries, the curries of which we are not very familiar with, and often on a lot of occasions we don't want to familiarize ourselves with those sort of curries, right? So I mean, add on to that, like, of course, it will be very nice to listen a bit from you as well. Like, when you go around at the community level, you are having street foods in New York or other parts of the US, and when you think around these perspectives, did you happen to ever share with the people? Did you ever tell them that, of course, in a very sweet and nice way, that what you are claiming is an authentic Indian street food is not very authentic and
mhm,
it's very assimilative in nature?
mhm. Good question. I usually don't. Part of it, of course, because of the precarious nature of a lot of these businesses. Especially, I'm more opinionated the more expensive the food is. I'm less opinionated the closer it is to kind of a culture of poverty. And in fact, nicely matches Dr. Bose's question there. Now, maybe I'll start off with that, which is this question of continuity and change. And of course, in one way, as a sociologist, there's a lot of literature on this argument that there's more blending, partly because as modern consumers, late modern consumers, we have become much more omnivorous. For instance, One of the arguments made, say, by in Josie Johnston and Sean Bauman's book Foodies, is the idea. This is an American context, but it works, I think, in many parts of the world. Is the idea that as upper class consumers, we have in fact become more omnivorous, which is different from old-fashioned snobbery, where in some ways we don't want to consume certain things and consume and think certain things are inferior. I think that thing still continues in India, by caste, by tribe, often by religion. So it's not all gone away, that disdain and disgust towards the other, but there is an element in which urban upper classes, in fact, have become more omnivorous. The research, a lot of the sociological research happens in the domain of music first, and then it gets to food. So, for instance, you would be listening to European classical music and disdaining jazz, and or subsequently down the road, when hip hop emerges in the 1980s, you will say, this is not real music. Real music is European classical music. Or by then, you will claim jazz is good music and hip hop is bad music. But what's happening, of course, is in some ways by the 1980s, 1990s, partly because of the circulation of people, partly because of the circulation of media and mediatization, there is increasing familiarity with difference, and people are beginning to consume a lot more. So today, to be an partly a cultural elite, to have cultural capital, you will have to consume opera and European music, classical music, and jazz, and rock and roll, and hip hop. And there would be, in some ways, no global music culture without hip hop, which was amazing. It emerges out of poor Black communities, urban communities, and spreads around the world and becomes an idiom around the world. So, but I'll also give a slight counterexample. So that is true that there's a degree of change and flexibility because of more ubiquitous encounters. But then I would also point to traditional cuisines and styles were not very continuous in themselves. Like think about Indian food. What would Indian food be before chilies and tomatoes and potatoes? Okay. And they are all 19th and 20th century. So Sidney Mintz, the anthropologist, used to say this in a very enigmatic way. He used to say, people are very conservative about their food until they change their mind. So the question is, what is that until they change their mind? Think about Indian food without chilies. Right? Chili is a very 19th, 20th century phenomenon. Okay. Think about Bengali food without potatoes. I mean, we know Bengali biryani because of the added potato in it. Okay. And think about Indian food without gobi comes much later in some ways, right? So my Uriya grandmother, Ai, until her dying day, called tomatoes Bilaiti Baigono, which means foreign eggplant. Okay. And so these are, and so in some ways, it appears from a distance that things used to be more continuous and pure before. But if you go and look at it, okay, you will see this radical transformation in Indian taste long before now, which is 200 years ago. And the interesting stories are to stories that tell the questions of continuity and discontinuity. And I'll end with your example, curry is a good example, and I'll illustrate with a kind of a interesting example in which curry, for instance, by the way, our book title, Curried Cultures, was a kind of an insider joke. It was full of disdain about this question of curry. Instead of kind of going aggressively against it, let's, in some ways, we said, let's play with it, just like hip hop artists would play with the N word. Okay. So, in some ways, to defang it and in some ways destroy it. And some of the attempt is there, and some of it successful, and some of it not so successful. And one of the things about curry is the way curry reaches Japan, which becomes something called curry raisu, very common. Okay, there are a lot of curry restaurants, and it initially it has nothing to do with Indian food. It comes to the British Navy because the Japanese, after the Meiji Restoration, and especially after the defeat of in the Russo-Japanese War, are trying to modernize, and they're arguing we should be, our military should be like the Germans, and our navy should be like the British. And what do people eat on the British Navy? Are these stews with curry powder in it. So the Japanese curry, in fact, has nothing to do with India. It has to do with the British Navy. Okay. And if you look at the Japanese curry, it is much sweeter. It uses of course, commercial curry powder, and it has all these foreign vegetables in it, potatoes, carrots. Okay, so in some ways, this is a very interesting question: how curries circulate and how they, in some ways, sometimes totally skip India. In this particular case, pulled out of India into the British Navy and circulates from the British Navy into the Japanese Navy, and from the Japanese Navy. By the way, navies and militaries, and we unfortunately don't have any work on much good work on India on it, are a very important institution. How you create certain kinds of these archetypical dishes that you're talking about. Okay, so like curry rice soup, it pulls people from all the regions of Japan. Okay, and feeds them curry rice on the navy, and then they go back home. They either open those restaurants because they can't find it, or they demand those restaurants. So often these archetypes, okay, and your first question is that's how we, by the way, get Indian restaurants in most of the global cities in the world, largely through Bangladeshi migrants, specifically Shileti migrants who are working in the British Navy, Merchant Navy, and a very similar process. So in some ways, Indian curry is almost, I would say, a merchant navy, a British merchant navy food that develops and disseminates in interesting ways. So we are back to this question of continuity and change. Okay, and some of it intentional, some of it unintentional. By the way, thanks for asking these very subtle questions. And sorry, I have to give long answers to your subtle questions because they're subtle.
I don't know. Absolutely. I think I think we are just loving the conversation. And by the time you responded, we already have a few more comments and questions. There is another comment from Dr. Indrajit Bose, but we will come to that a bit later. We have a couple of new questions, and then we'll come to that. So we have Shubhodip Jana asking here. It's a another interesting question, I would say, and it's the question about leftovers. So Shubhodip asks, in households, leftovers are not always discarded. Often they are, and they can be turned into certain delicious and nutrition ones. And there are also certain leftovers which get stale and are thrown away as wasted. So in caste narratives, as Shubhodip says, that he feels that this politics of the leftovers can be seen in quite a prominent way. So, how do you approach the leftovers? Maybe in alignment with your experiences of different places and households, or maybe a peep on the fridge, perhaps.
Exactly. Excellent question. A couple of things. And excellent question. And in fact, I have been reading lately in writing a review for Shahu Patole's book, Dalit Kitchens of Marathwada, which I think is a kind of a very important intervention. I've been reading Valmiki. It's right in front of me now. Om Prakash Valmiki's Jutan. And Jutan, of course, is he calls it an untouchable life. And this question of Juta, this question of kind of which is often very closely related to questions of stale, but not necessarily stale and contaminated by because saliva in at least pure Brahminic conceptions is supposed to be contaminating and also in some ways structured around a hierarchy. So a highly valent notion of stale on one side of that. In even I come from a Shudra background, but there's an aspirational quality to that, right? Even in Shudra lives, there's an aspirational quality to behave like Brahmins for upward mobility, which M.N. Srinivas calls Sanskritization in the sociological literature. So there's a kind of a on one side there's a conceptual disdain about it, and I forget the name of the person who asked the question. Let me see. Hold on. Um,
His name is Shubhodip.
Shubhadeep. Okay.
Yes, yes.
And Shubhadeep's question is a beautiful question because though on one hand we have this. Uh, I would say, a transcendental posture, which is very casteist in some ways, in our aperture. But on the other side, on an everyday basis, of course, we are routinely saving leftovers, because partly we come from a society of relative scarcity, and we don't throw anna away. And the place I come from, Odisha, coastal Odisha, the biggest exemplar of it is, of course, pokhala bhato, which is panta bhat, okay, which is leftover turned into a much more interesting dish at the end of it, which is a couple of days of fermentation in a terracotta pot, and which is leftover rice with water added, and it takes a couple of days. And honestly, that used to be the best meal. So we have on one side the ideology of jhuta and all that stuff, then we have the pragmatic life of we love it, okay, every bit of it. And I when I used to go and visit my takuma in Balasore, that would be an important part of a summer meal. It was good. We would eat a pokhara bhatto, panta bhat, and often she would, in fact, she was the last one, I think, who had the skills to catch, what is the word I'm forgetting? The shell, Gary, she used to call. What's the English word? There's a famous, popular French dish. What's it called? When you kind of cook Gary in butter. What is the
Yes,
word for get?
we in Bengali we call it googly.
Googly, right? We
Googly,
used to
yes.
call in Odia Gary,
Yes, in Bengali
googly.
we call it
What is the
googly.
English word? What is the English word for it?
That's that's the
Totally
toughest
escapes me
part.
right now. Totally will come. You know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
And she would collect them, and then she would collect basically herbs from around the pukur, around the pond, and cook it with these alliums. So onion and garlic, and we would eat it with pakhala bhatto or panta bhat, so in some ways what is absolutely fascinating is this ideology of purity and and no jhuta and no chutan, and in the ideology of in some ways arguing against leftovers, but in pragmatic everyday life it is constantly happening, of course, and probably the most interesting, the most conserving, economically and ecologically, leftovers. And of course, now my everyday cooking is in fact often always has. I do cooking almost every day. And doing cooking in the American context, I cook for my son. I often have guests. We are usually using cooking. I'm usually cooking something fresh and new and aligning it with something left over. Okay, so often my salad dressing I have made from scratch, like a green goddess dressing. So the other day I made a roasted pepper, like a coulis, and the next day my son then had made a salad and used that coulis as a dressing on top of it. So we are constantly working with, in some ways, leftovers. And leftovers are a very important part of any culinary culture, okay? And continues to be so, notwithstanding all our ideological grandstanding around it.
Awesome. And I think what you shared, Prof, right now, with respect to the question of leftovers, sort of continues in a wider and a bit more generic framework with Aishwarya's question of how can we say ethnicity shape the way immigrant cuisine is archived, remembered, and valued in culinary history. And I think it also sort of ties to Genia's question later on as well.
Very, very good. And I honestly think two things. I mean, of course, remember, I'm older than most of you, and I'm kind of a teacher. So my first insight is we need so much more work on Indian migrants in India. To just give you an example, there are 30 million Indian diaspora in the rest of the world. There are 100 million Indians moving in within India. And we, in fact, don't know that very well. We have not studied that. And it is surrounding in our everyday life. You can see it in the reference you made of street foods. A lot of street foods are basically food that is made and produced by a kind of families that have been moved from the countryside, small towns to the big cities. Okay. They are also working with archetypes, pani puri, golgappa, puchka, etc., chaat, and they're also improvising, and there's a degree of improvisation and a degree of continuity. People are started adding grated cheeses on things recently. I don't like it, but other people like it, so that's good. Remind me of the question again. Sorry. Yep. Uh, let's
Yeah, so
see.
the basically the question is about the aspect of ethnicity and how ethnicity shaped the
Good
immigrant
archive.
cuisines and how those sort of ideas are archived, remembered, and valued in culinary histories.
Excellent. So, in some ways, in the international frame, surprisingly, that is less studied than the global international frame, partly because of more literate culture and more attention to it. And especially when you cross boundaries, you become easier to surveil national boundaries. Hence, in some ways, ironically, diasporic cultures have been better studied than migrant cultures at home. That's true about China, that's true about Nigeria, that's true about India, that's also true about United States. But given the context of how certain groups of people came to be associated with certain kinds of cooking. And the example I gave before, I'll continue, which is that, say, about at one point of time, about the 300 Indian restaurants in New York City. Almost two-thirds of it was largely run and owned and cooked by Bangladeshis. It's changing. The ratios are going down now. We have a few more Gujaratis, few more Punjabis. But for instance, very few Bengalis or very few Andhrites or very few Tamilians run Indian restaurant other than some chains. And of course, that's mostly like, say, Kannada chains, like, say, various dosa and Italy, different places. But in general, and that is linked to Anglophonity, those who can use English language and also have a credential, say like me, who can get a job in the formal economy. Those who cannot, either because they are not Anglophone or they do not have credentials that transfer, often have to get into micro entrepreneurship, small entrepreneurship, okay? Because they need a certain kind of familiarity with the food and a certain kind of capital and cultural capital. To start a small restaurant in New York City, in the right place, you will, with a couple of partners, you can start with about $50,000, which is a lot of money if you are using Indian money. But if you are working for a few years, a lot of my restaurants I studied in the ethnic restaurateur were often taxi drivers who had moved from taxi driving, saved about $10,000 each, partnered with 6 or 7 people, so that put 60, $70,000, and rented a place and then started a restaurant, because these were often, say, in my ethnic restaurateur book, the one of the main characters there is Muhammad Rasul, a Pakistani who in some ways runs this restaurant. And I asked him, so why do you, and he calls it an Indian restaurant, and I said, why do you call it an Indian restaurant, not a Pakistani restaurant? He says, because you see, Americans, they don't know geography. So if I say Pakistan, they'll confuse it with Afghanistan, they'll confuse it with some other place. People are more familiar with Indian, so I call it Indian. Okay, so you see what's happening. A Punjabi Pakistani has to make a living in this context and has to name it that is legible to outsiders. Because remember, most Indian restaurants in the US right now, in New York City right now, are largely feeding outsiders. They're not feeding insiders within the community itself. So you have to use certain kinds of signatures around it. So in one of the conversations, I said, he said, how would you describe the food? And he says, well, it's like, it's a bit like Spanish food, but a little more spices. By that, by Spanish food, he basically meant stewy food with a little bit of meat and sauces. And by Spanish, he really meant Puerto Rican, Hispanic, not Spanish from Spain. Okay, because that's his exposure to who is speaking Spanish in this city. So in some ways, that's a fascinating question, because that has happened at least through all of American history, and that's probably true about many parts of the world, including India, that in the cities we have often been fed by migrants who are outsiders. So, how do outsiders know what insiders want? So it's this dialogue and this kind of a dynamic of producing archetypes and stereotypes. So then what is called Indian food is stuck in a mold of what becomes, I would say, Bengali made Punjabi food, which has a Mughlai inflection. So your chicken tikka masalas and stuff, which is can be great in their own ways. The other day I had dal makhni, which was very good. But it's a certain archetype. It's impossible to find. Maybe I'll end here. All the Indian food I've eaten, at least in the United States, which is a lot in terms of restaurants, I've never eaten one dish that has ever been made in my household, my mother's household, my grandmother's household. And of course, as my son Rudra said to me, I think yesterday, he said, "How is it, Dad, that you take the cuisines of 1.5 billion people with 125 languages, with 33,000 dialects, which is much more than Europe, okay? And then you go out and eat, you get similar tasting dishes, 12 dishes." So how do you do that? I said, well, that's the magic of the marketplace in some ways. Okay. So this transformation, and that is a forms of reduction because not all home cooking can be transformed into restaurant cooking. And by the way, that's also not only true about Indian food, that's also true about French food and Italian food. When I go to Italy, I teach. I've now taught for a decade in Italy in the Slow Food University. The markets are full of green vegetables. When I go out in a restaurant in the Piedmont, the cheese is fantastic, the sausage is fantastic, the tagine is fantastic, the pasta is fantastic. I cannot buy cooked greens to eat. The only cooked greens people eat at home. They often don't serve in restaurants. In restaurants, they'll serve salads, but they won't serve cooked greens. So that's true about a lot of cuisines in the world, which is not only do you have regional differences and sub-regional differences, but you will also have the difference of idiom. What is considered restaurant food is different from home cooking almost everywhere in the world, but I would say it is probably even more acute with Indian food abroad.
Great. Thank you so much for this fascinating and very elaborative response. And I was also, when I was listening to you with respect to the question of identity of how often, South Asian food vastly emerges as the Indian food. It also has to do with market as well, in terms of the marketization perspective. And in a lot of spaces I have seen, it also has to do with the political tensions as well. I remember when I was in Johannesburg, and there used to be the place called the Fordsburg, and Fordsburg again used to be that migrant place where you see a lot of Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, Eastern Africans, North Africans, of course Indians, and many other people from other parts of South Asia, where the Bangladeshis would actually represent their shop as the Indian shop. And it has to do, of course, with the question of marketization, and then also the identity, the tension, the politics, the of identity tensions. Because if they're calling themselves as Bangladeshi shops or getting stuffs from Bangladesh, even if it is an Indian shop and they have stuffs from Bangladesh, people don't mind. But that identity often sort of presents a kind of cultural redundancy which probably could be overcome if they represent themselves as Indian. So I think this is actually such an interesting dynamics to think around.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's the contingent politics of the location shapes identities because identities, remember, are not just things we are born with, they are strategies. Okay, it's the strategies we play. We become Indian. I never thought I was Indian until I left India. Okay, the other identities were much more important, contested. Of course, national identities have become louder and more shrill with nativism everywhere. But in a sense, identity is always a dialogic construction of local political context around it. Remember my example I gave you when I insist that I am a lot more Odia Odia than Bengali, it is also a politics of identity that's going on. And your example and your illustration is a fascinating intersection between migrants and markets. Because remember what migrants are. Migrants are primarily labor, seeking labor force participation. Migrants are very smart people everywhere, internationally or internationally. They go to places where there are jobs. Okay. And so migrants are always entangled as labor market participants in marketplaces. And that conjunction between migrants and marketplaces is, is a very productive nexus. And we should be doing a lot more research on that nexus and how local politics or the contingent politics of the time shapes identity, self-identity. So, for instance, and you can see that if you travel anywhere in the world, when people ask, where are you from? I start with India, and now, okay, in India, of course, in India, I never said India. There'll be an absurd answer if I gave India as an answer if people ask me where in India. Uh, uh, and then someone will say, no, 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 I know India. I'm familiar. I said, okay, so you're familiar with India. I'm Eastern Coastal India. It says, ah, yeah, where in Eastern Coastal India? So it almost takes five questions to get to, in some ways, Odia and Bengali. And of course, the Odia, coastal Odia culture is culinary culture is very different from the culture, say, of Koraput or Sambalpur into the plateau, but stronger, like say, Adivasi kind of element in the cuisine. And the more south you go, like say one of my mausis make chokoli pitha. Chokoli pitha is basically like a fermented dosa. Okay, homemade dosa. So you can see that boundary drawing and the self and the other. So partly it is kind of where you are, what you're coming from, and what are the frame of reference, the politics of it. And maybe and the other is kind of the dynamic dialogue with the others. Let me end with one example. My Odia grandmother, Ai, okay, she only spoke Odia. So all my life, all her life, I spoke to her in Odia. But she could only write Odia in the Bengali script because she got educated in Midnapur. So here is, and nations are filled with subjects like that. Okay. In some ways, subjects who are not, that can be easily contained by governmental notions of who belongs where. Okay. And there are millions of people in India like that. My grandmother, who is in some ways, if you asked her, she's Odia. But the only way she could write was in the Bengali script. So she wrote Odia in Bengali script. That's why for my mother who's Odia, in fact, she's better at writing Bengali than my father because my mother wrote her letters to her mother, okay, Odia letters in Bengali script. In fact, this is not that much of an exception. It is peculiarity of modern nationalism, ethno-linguistic nationalism, that we think people should just stick to one side of the border or the boundary. Nowhere in the world that's true, especially in India, it's not true. And that produces very interesting foods, like in some ways, think about the border region of Germany and France, Alsace-Lorraine, okay, tarte flambe, sausages, the beers, and the white wines of that region. And that's true about every other boundary and region in the world, that people are, in fact, on both sides of it. Governments don't like it because that interferes with their capacity for governmentality, how to contain and govern people. So in some ways, this is a good question to think through the questions of identity as dialogic, contingent, strategic, and also presentation of self. So my answer changes depending on who I'm talking to and when.
And as you know, to further expand the conversation about the politics of identity and food and representations, and in terms of its transformation in specific contexts, I know Indira had a comment which I can't see right now, but it was a very interesting comment, which I think also Aishwarya continues at the end as well, is the question about the gender politics in food. And Indira talked about, and it was a kind of continuity to Shubhodip's question about the leftovers. So who consumes the leftovers? In many households, it's about how, and also it's very true. Like even in my childhood days, I would see that by default, if there is a leftover rice or dal or whatever it is, by default, it would be the women of the household who will consume the leftovers because the fresh foods are meant for men. Whereas again, Aishwarya brings up a very interesting example, from the Nair households of Kerala, where often women would be consuming food before men, and also, you know, and these sort of interesting dynamics where sometimes it's the women who are taking care of the leftovers, but mostly what has been seen is, we also see like a very general culture across India where, leftovers, even if the leftovers are sort of kind of recycled, like a very common leftover food, at least in my childhood days, I've seen in my household is bhat bhaja, which of course doesn't, of course, I mean, literally translates to fried rice, but it is
Yes.
of course not fried rice, because bhat bhaja is, having leftover dry vegetables and food, and that will be consumed by my mother. And because I would consistently insist my mother, it tasted so amazing, that will be given to me in my lunchbox as well. But then, so maybe, Prof, if you can throw some light about this gender dynamics about the consumption of the leftover foods and all.
That's beautiful. And I think that's the tightness of gastropolitics and worth engaging with and analyzing around. The example, two things. I think Sharmila's question on Nair households, and I'm learning a lot because my sister-in-law is Rama Nagarajan. She is, in fact, from Nair household. So I'm learning all my easy patriarchal Eastern Indian assumptions get inverted, though it's matrilineal. She says it is much more matrilineal, but patriarchal. So it's a very interesting kind of a dynamic where the household, the daughters all live with the mothers, but the uncle acquires a lot of power over property. So it's a dynamic relationship between resources. Just because something is matrilineal, you don't end up with matriarchal. It can be matrilineal, but patriarchal. And I'm learning, I don't know enough about it. Every time I go out, go to India and hang out with her kind of almost every year, a couple of months. It's a kind of a fantastic lesson from her and from her mother about the attention one must pay to these local dynamics around it. So that's my first takeaway. The second is you're absolutely right about leftover. Leftover, I think I would say initially we got a refrigerator. The other day I asked my brother, when did we get the refrigerator? Because that was the first sign, because my brother responded at that time, মা না বাবাই আমরা কি একটু বড়লোক হচ্ছি? Then are we getting rich because we just got a refrigerator? Okay, and so that was in 1974. There was almost no food as leftover because we have a part of this kind of everyday shopping and everyday cooking, which is very gender intensive labor. The refrigerator had cold water, and when we got a little more affluent, sometimes a cold drink and yogurt, doi. Okay, homemade doi. It almost never had leftovers. Much later in life, my mother's refrigerator would be full of leftovers. Initially, when the leftover, so either my mom would eat it, or often she'll give it away to the servants, the domestic workers. Okay, who'd come to prepare the next day's food. So there's a gender hierarchy and a class hierarchy embedded in it. Okay, which is this question of, I think, a Brahminical question of, in some ways, pure and impure. That is gets translated in a particular way, and of course, now I'm going to flip it right now. Right now, the biggest consumer of leftover is my son, partly because he's my son, he's young, and I run a household where I do all the cooking. So now I know if I put leftovers away in the fridge, either it'll be eaten late at night after he has done his gaming and he's gone to work next day, then he'll come back for lunch. So in some funny ways, leftover has become, in some ways, a reward in your case, Sion, to kind of think about it as the child who has become, in this case, the kind of the quasi-adult, about the adult. He's finished college, he works, he comes back, but maybe the social dynamic of my household has changed in a way in which it has become a valued commodity rather than an undervalued commodity. And I think here it reminds me of Arjun Appadurai's work on social life of things. Things do not have one thing. Things are not one thing. They have a biography. They start from something, okay? They start in, let's say, in my mother's case, of domestic labor, domesticated labor, gender, women's labor, men's food. Then the next day it becomes her food or the servant's food. In my case, my son's food, okay? So in some ways, thinking through this, the social life of a thing called leftover. Okay, we should be writing absolutely fantastic things about it because I think there are very divergent kind of trajectories of what happens to things called leftovers in ideology and in practice. And there's always a gap between these two. And the gap is interesting to kind of to watch and observe. So we might be claiming certain kinds of values, but we may be pragmatically driving other values.
Great. And to further, sort of make the conversation interesting, Neha has a very important and very interesting point to share where Neha talks about that how Dalit narratives around food, around cuisines, have vastly to do with the question of emphasis on food and hunger, whereas there is quite a bit of lack of Dalit cookbooks across the country. And since we are talking so much about authenticity, ethnicity, assimilation, ignorance, hyper highlighting certain foods for the sake of marketization and refugee and migrants and so many perspectives. So, what will be your thoughts about this, Prof?
Beautiful, beautiful point. Which is, of course, I mean, again, this question of materiality, reality of hunger, and its reflection, and how it gets reflected in thinking and writing and recuperating, and especially memorializing. Because remember, cookbooks are almost not so much as what we are doing now, are in fact reflections of aspirations and past and nostalgia. So there's a kind of a style of writing about it, and hunger plays an important role. I would draw an analogy here, and the analogy is with the Irish. And Hasia Diner wrote this beautiful book called Hungering for America. And she asked this question, why don't the Irish in America identify or write much about their food, while the Italians are going on and on about it, and the Jews in some ways are some Eastern European Jews are somewhere in between. One of her answers she gives is in some ways, and then I extend it in one of my responses to her, is that in the Irish nationalist movement, hunger and starvation becomes an important mobilizing sense of identity of the Irish and their anti-colonial sensibility. Okay, so in some ways, in a context where discourse is dominated by a kind of hunger and also a form of public masculinity, there'll be Irish and drinking, a lot of jokes and a lot of commentary about it, okay, about beer and pubs, which are also social spaces of working class masculinity. So here you see this complex relationship between ideology, representation, and everyday practice. In some cultures, in some contexts, I think hunger gets accentuated more than in some ways appetite. Okay. And that is, I think each of these stories need to be told in interesting ways where Neha's argument is absolutely on the mark, and how to think about food, cooking, recipes in the context where hunger is a crucial part of your experience, and then as an important part of an ideological making of a Dalit sensibility in this case, which is in fact very similar to the Irish sensibility.
Great. And what is really great to see as well that we also have a tangential conversation already going on in the chat box, which is so fascinating to see that people having their thoughts sharing already here. We will sort of conclude because I mean, I'm saying sort of because I'm sure we will again find avenues to continue our conversations for sure. But for the time being, we will conclude with this one, a very interesting question from Ginny, and I know we have already talked about the question of assimilation and contradiction, and it's a very interesting question. What Ginny asks is about if authenticity in culinary tradition is contradicting the assimilationist food consumption practices and thereby impacting our identity formation.
How would you could you renew the question?
Oh,
I
sure.
didn't
So,
get.
so the
Yeah.
question is authenticity in culinary
Ah,
tradition contradicting the assimilationist food consumption practices, thereby affecting identity formation?
exactly, exactly. And yes, authenticity in some ways. And you're absolutely right that there is, in some ways, they're pulling in different direction. Authenticity, if you think about what we think about as authenticity, and authentic something is a true copy of something, which is, you can already see the paradox in there, okay? Which is a true copy, okay? And so, of course, it means you have some notion of a copy and some notion of true. Okay, and true and truthfulness, and which is this question of this is a quest for accuracy and sincerity. I think those are the two impulses that are driving it, is a search for accuracy and sincerity. And especially if you're talking about authenticity in the context of transnational or intranational migration, there's always this challenge of things that change, things you hope would not change, refuse to change around it. Because in that sense, we are anyone, an immigrant, like any other modern human being, in some ways seeks to keep some things the same and wants to change some things. Right? And that gets played out in cuisine in complicated ways. And often, so for instance, typically, it would be very unusual if people adapted all the religions that they went to in the new places. Most people do not adapt the new religions, with some exceptions. And the exception often becomes in the New World, in the Caribbean, with slavery and indenture, often new religions, old kind of new religions in the new spaces are adapted. But most migrants, for instance, unless they're forced to, okay, unless they're oppressed, will not change their religion, but Indians will eat Thai food. Okay. And in fact, I'll give you with a kind of became a joke in my migrants table. I had this very intense question about how important is identity to your kind of food practices. And most people, 100 out of 126, most people said, well, food is not that important to my identity. I said, what? I've I built this whole project around the assumption that food is important. So then I had to I do a kind of a follow-up question. And the follow-up question, it become clarified. They said, often would say, see, if my daughter goes out and eats Thai food today and Japanese food tomorrow, it's not like she's betraying her identity. Okay? It's part of a legitimate omnivorous experience of the urban experience. But I don't want her to marry someone else. So marry you do once in life. I want her to marry people like us. Okay, it's a conserving kind of a thing. Okay, but she can go and eat whatever she wants to eat. It is not a threat to identity. See, look what's happened with identity here. It becomes a contingent process compared to what? Compare and for so when I went into this initial research, I thought, oh, food is very important. Food is important. But the way identity plays around food is quite different as it plays around things like who you marry, okay, and what, for instance, clothing you wear. In some ways, food in some ways can be a lot more like clothing in some ways, if you think about it. South Asia is one of the last places in the world where, in fact, the sari and the salwar kameez, and these are not just traditional, they are also modernized. We know the sari and the blouse came at a particular point of time in a very modern sensibility around it. But some things change and they're gendered. Men look like what I'm wearing, have been wearing all my life, okay, shirts and pants. Okay, but my mother always wore sari. My cousins often use salmar kameez now in an urban context. They'll use sari for a wedding or a special occasion. Okay, my sister-in-law wears saris, beautiful saris, and her rule is to only buy them directly from the handcrafted saris and then wear them. So you have different strategies of what it means to be a particular kind, in this case, Indian or something else, Odia. And so food allows, because we do it at least 3 times a day, if not more, it allows us kind of a cherry picking. Okay. And in most parts of the world today, other than things that touch the third rail, in India, could be meat, could be beef, there's a sense that you can eat all kinds of food, but that does not change your identity. Okay, and on other occasions, and here I'll give you one last example. It's astonishing how syncretic Indian wedding meals have become. Okay, all kinds of food from all over the place is put together there, and in some ways, the traditional, in some, what would be my say the youngest pishis and mashis bobhat in the marriage wedding ceremony was a lot more traditional than it is now. Okay, it has got much more cosmopolitan. So in funny ways, in the most traditional moment of a wedding, the wedding feast has become much more syncretic and much more fusion in one direction. Okay, in an everyday sensibility, it has, but probably the Shraddho meal has remained most conservative, partly because death is probably the most complicated thing to respond to as a group, as a person, as a social order. And I see that transformation happening. So in some ways, it is too easy to overgeneralize how things are changing, and too easy to overgeneralize as things are staying the same, unless we are attentive to the contingent politics of identity making in a particular context. That's why we need all these studies, rather than make overgeneralizing claims without studying anything.